So now it is my great privilege to invite 4 leaders who are shaping the future of economic justice to the stage. You have their bios, so I will simply add a few personal notes. Anne-Marie Burgoyne, please come, is a visionary philanthropist at the Emerson Collective, who moonlights as a cabaret singer. Jamie Kalamarides, who is a serious insurance executive, but who demonstrates social media skills that would put any millennial to shame. Napoleon Wallace, a state policy leader whose career spans every sector, but who has a personality that defies any connection to his namesake. And Bill Bynum, one of the nation's CDFI leaders, and a passionate commitment to eliminate persistent poverty, who's the only person I know who's named his organization after his wife. Can we all move down one?
Great.
So my job today is really to create a platform for you to hear what these 4 people, who I could spend the rest of my life with, have to say. What I want them to do is talk about how they view their roles in addressing wealth inequality, how their business model has changed in these times or not, and the partnerships they believe will advance economic justice with high-impact, sustainable solutions. So let's start. Jamie, I'm going to ask you first. What strengths and weaknesses do you face in achieving your purpose or mission?
Sure. The for-profit financial services organizations, and Prudential in particular, bring some great strengths to be able to tackle the challenges that Andrea and Andy laid out before it. We bring capital. We bring skills and resources that we can bring to bear with innovation with our clients and experiment to create scale. And then the opportunities are, how do we create financial wellness that's sustainable by creating a marketplace that is self-sufficient and grows over time? Now, there are some real challenges with the for-profit financial services market as well. And that is, many of you and many consumers are skeptical or don't trust the industry. And so we have to overcome that. And the way we do that, the way Prudential does that, is focus on purpose. Because with aligned values, we can focus on doing well and doing good at the same time. These things don't need to be in conflict. And Andy mentioned earlier that we see great opportunity in partnering with employers at the workplace, with associations, with unions, with other groups of gig workers to be able to help individuals at the point that they get paid, at the point that they have income, so that they can buy and scale, so that they can use group purchasing power, and so that they get the protections afforded by the ERISA regulatory environment.
Thank you. Anne-Marie, from a philanthropic perspective, how do you approach these issues?
So I think we've been lucky enough at the Emerson Collective, and this is true of philanthropy. We have a lot of flexibility and we have a lot of unchecked opportunity. And so for us, we've had an organizing principle around self-reliance, which is very Emersonian. But it's allowed us to really push ourselves to ask the question, are the opportunities we're seeking out to support ones that don't just take all the boats and rise the level, but actually make a very conscious choice to seek out individuals and communities that have historically had less opportunity and really to invest there. So I think that's the baseline, is that self-reliance is where we start. We've been lucky enough to do our grant making in a fairly opportunistic way. We're not theory of change people, we're quality of entrepreneur, quality of idea people, which has allowed us to then really meet people where they are. We do a lot of C3 grant making, but we do a lot of C4 grant making. We run an incubator that supports people who want to use technology to forward immigration opportunities. We run fellowship programs. So one of the other benefits we have that we've really tried to use is that we have the flexibility to use dollars in a way that are responsive to the people in front of us who are doing important work. A third place I think we've tried to build strength is we're actually structured as an LLC. So I do philanthropic work, but not in a foundation structure. And other individuals at Emerson Collective focus on advocacy, convening, communications, media. We have a team that just does for-profit investing, which means we have our eyes and ears open in a lot more communities and in a lot more ways than other folks. And it also allows us to then take on projects which are demonstrable, which are pretty risk-seeking, and which are pretty innovative. That's a word Jamie used, and I think we can really embrace that. We run a fairly large high school redesign project, which is as much about, it's called XQ Institute, it's out of Oakland, but it's as much about showing demonstrative high schools doing high school work very differently as it is about changing the conversation about what high school needs to mean in America for young people who want to go on to college or want to get the job that allows them to be the reliant person they want to be. Or we work with Arnie Duncan in Chicago and run a program called Chicago Cred, which is working with cohorts of young men who are very at risk. And it's as much about bringing service to them as it is communicating to the Chicago community and our national community that we can't leave people behind. We can't forget people. We need to find ways for them to find their own sense of opportunity, and we need to celebrate that and we need to embrace that. So it's that piece around the work, the advocacy, the communication, and doing it together. But I will also say, I think we were less strong at not being coastal people. We're not the only people who weren't coastal people, but we've spent the last year listening and learning a lot, mapping out our work in ways that are very geographic, visiting communities that we've historically spent less time in, and that's been really important to us to find the holes in our work. So it is a model that I think has a lot of potential, but it is a model too that we've continued to have to push ourselves to use as effectively as possible.
And good, and we'll talk about that more. So Napoleon, Anne-Marie talked about being able to take risk. Working in state government, I'm sure that's what you do every day. So tell us a little bit about how you're operating in your area.
Absolutely. So, many of you know North Carolina is a purple state, I guess you could say that, or you might say it's a red and blue polka dotted state might be a better way to describe it. So taking risk isn't really that far from the truth coming into work. One of the things that I think that is representative by the way that our state is shaped is that we do believe that we have some really interesting strengths and as well as weaknesses. On the strength side, we have real political will to make changes around issues of wealth, inequality, access to workforce, wages, that sort of thing. We feel like we got a very clear mandate. Governor Cooper feels like we got a very clear mandate on what we could do and kind of, where we need to go. And so that's something that we've been tackling head on. My work surrounds workforce, small town economic development. If you've heard anything about the, kind of urban-rural divide, that sits very cleanly around some of the wealth creation work. Mm-hmm. And then on the workforce side, it's how you get the wages in. So we're doing some really interesting sort of testing there, whether it be requirements around economic development, that certain wages be met, that benefits be met, pushing for items like that, which is a little bit risky. One of the things that we're seeing that I'd say is a little bit of a weakness, and I don't think this is necessarily a weakness just for us, but really a weakness for everyone. You mentioned earlier that you laid out the cities, and there's this kind of historical context in which we're operating within, right? If we were thinking about this from the perspective of restorative justice, right? Like there's a process around that. There's a recognition of what's come before you and what needs to be done in order to account for that so that you can then move forward through some of the investments that you want to make. In economic development and workforce, it doesn't really exist. And so there's a headwind that we're seeing in a lot of cases where we go into a community and start talking about wages without unpacking that there's some real issues, policies, sort of undergirding concerns that are there that are creating these headwinds, and we're not necessarily able to see them. They're a little invisible. So I'm really excited, one, to see some of the work that you all are doing around that racial wealth divide, and recognizing that it's not just a number today, but that it's also a history of policies that have led us there, because I think that can be applied in a lot of other places. But that sort of weakness is something that we're seeing a lot of across our state, and something we're trying to attack head on.
So the reality you described in some communities is the reality of the entire service area that Bill Bynum is serving today in the Delta. And so I'd love you to describe, in many ways, you were the most prepared for the world today because that was the world you have always worked in. How you're seeing that task today and how that's changed.
Thanks, Andrea. That's unfortunately very true. Work in a region that is home to 1/3 of the counties in the nation that have had over 20% poverty for at least 3 decades in a row. Deep, entrenched poverty, largely rooted in racism, in not investing in people, trying to extract rather than invest. And every day when I drive through our region, whether it's in Memphis, where Dr. King was killed, or through the Mississippi Delta in the county where Emmett Till was killed, or in Jackson where we've had the privilege of working with the Evers family. They're members of our credit union. And when I drive across the Edmund Pettus Bridge to our new branch in Montgomery, Alabama, you're reminded of, I'm not a Nike, I'm not hyping Nike here, but the notion that believing something, even if it means sacrificing everything, is something that so many people in the Deep South have done. And when you're in Selma, when you drive through Selma, it is still the poorest town in the state of Alabama. And you don't see any, you see it dotted with petty lenders and check cashers and predators who are preying on the most vulnerable. And then you turn around and we're excited about the fact that we've been able to open, we've gone from 7 to 30 plus branches since the financial crisis in places where banks have shut down. 2,000 plus bank branches shut down since the financial crisis, 95% of them in low-income communities. Not because people stopped needing reasonable, affordable loans to help their families in emergency situations or to buy a house, but because they're not as profitable. I give a lot of credit to our partners who have helped us to do this work. We've been doing some things with Bank of America, for example. They have decided they're going to invest in CDFIs in areas despite CRA. They're not looking at where they have branches. Branches are an artifact of the Ice Age. People just don't use branches
Or
as
when
much.
we grew up.
Yeah, way back then. But they're making investments. Other banks are making investments in places. But I had the opportunity to talk to a CEO of another major bank recently who said, I'm not going to invest in persistent poverty areas in rural places because I don't make as much money there. Contrast that. And that's the environment that we live in now. Unfortunately, things have not changed dramatically. The people in the communities where we live are grappling with conditions that are very similar to the ones that they survived in the late 60s and the 70s. It's not as in your face, but I guess it's becoming more and more in your face these days. And so people are struggling with really tough situations, but I take a lot from the people we work with in the communities. They are persistent. They teach me a lot when we listen to them. I've heard a lot of talk about listening, about cooperation. And I think if you listen to people in the communities that we serve and the ones we work in, then we'll learn what it takes and what they need. And it's our job as community development professionals, as human beings, to make sure people have the tools that they need to live the lives that many of us take for granted.
So let's mix it up a little, as you guys can interrupt each other as well. How has your business model changed or adapted over the last several years as you think about your work? And some of you have already started to talk about that, but Bill, I know it's changed for you in a very specific way. Would you lead us off, and then we'll add to that?
Sure, as I mentioned, I'm really I'm going all in on the communities where we work. And on partners. So many partners in this room that I rely on. All of you on the stage are among those. But we have, for example, in the past 2-3 years, we have been working with 7 small towns, none of them larger than 3,000 people. And we've been actually doing something pretty novel. We're asking them, what would it take to improve conditions in your community, to help your children to realize a better future? And they'll tell us the same things that I learned when I was working on this Gates Commission when we visited Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. The people in the Mississippi Delta say, we need better housing conditions, we need better education, we need jobs, we need health care. We have food deserts, banking deserts, health deserts, education deserts. And we want better conditions for our children. And so we work with them, and they've developed plans, and we're now working with them to find resources to execute those plans. Unfortunately, they don't have the ability to come to Washington and be around all you experts. We take your information and go back to those communities. I was on Capitol Hill about 3 weeks ago, and you can imagine the congressional delegations from my region are not the most progressive. But when I told them that we are working with these municipalities and they are looking for federal support, they said, that is great. We need someone who can help translate that, because we have billions of dollars that we're trying to get into these communities that they don't have the ability to access. You know, these were red state legislators who are actually saying, we want to work with you to close that gap. I'm gonna give them a shot to do it.
Really?
Why not?
And Bill, can you talk about, because I found this part of your work really compelling, can you talk some about the work you've done with taking your materials and culturally bringing them to a wider array of individuals in the communities you've historically worked in?
No, it's interesting. We have one of the most biracial populations in the country. Mississippi is not only one of the poorest states in the nation, it's the blackest. And Louisiana's right behind it. But we have a growing Hispanic population in our region, and unfortunately, women, all people of color, the Hispanic population are on the outside of the economy looking in disproportionately. So we've been working to translate our materials. 40% of our credit union members didn't have an account before they joined the credit union. Another 25% rely on high-cost predatory lenders. So 65+% unbanked or underbanked. And so we have been very intentional locating our branches in communities of color. We just opened a branch, was donated to us by Regions Bank in Southwest Little Rock. That's a primarily Hispanic community. We've hired Hispanic staff. We've converted our materials. We have been working with the local government there. We are the only financial institution that's accepting their local identification as a primary identification, so that we can open accounts for undocumented individuals. And we've created an I-10 product. So we are really excited about expanding our ability to serve underserved populations, regardless of their color. We know that, again, they need the same things that we all need. It's our job to make sure they have the opportunity. Thank you.
Napoleon, how about your communities?
So one of the things that I think we're trying to kind of wrestle our way through right now is trying to have a good understanding for what we can do better in all of our smaller communities, and then especially on the workforce front. So in terms of kind of how we've changed the model, if you will. One of the big models, I'm sure everyone knows this, traditional economic development is a lot about what they're calling the buffalo hunting, right? Like go out and search for the big businesses and try to recruit them to your state, and pray that good things happen after that, right? Like, and that's the model for a long time. One of the things that we've seen with rising disparity, communities not necessarily having the resources they need to be able to even attract or have outreach to those sorts of businesses, is you really do have to turn the model on its head and say, what investments can you start making in local communities, whether it be from planning perspective, whether it be guidance around policies, whether it be investments in local infrastructure, local supports, so that they can do some level of outreach on their own. It's something that, you know, we've been doing for a while, but historically we've had the kind of, we'll say the support, or at least alliance, of a very strong CDFI network that existed in North Carolina. That network was decimated a few years ago by some pretty aggressive policies. And it made it so that we had to have one of these, I mean, everybody gets a reference, you know, make $1 out of 15 cents. We kind of had to use that sort of approach to be able to get more dollars into these communities. It's been a very different sort of approach for us, using workforce, WIOA dollars, to be able to support or attract a business to a small community that historically has never gotten a large announcement. But as we've seen, is something that it's a way that we can make the process a bit more seamless, and also make it so that the communities that are most marginalized, the smallest, highest concentration of people of color, still have access and be able to attract alongside some of these other communities that do have all the resources, or a lot of the resources.
So Anne Marie, you've already talked about, in many ways, you're changing your approach to being more proximate with communities and others. I hate to give you the big question of how does philanthropy need to change in these times, but I'd love you to reflect a bit on your practice in that broader context.
Well, as Andrea knows, we wrote an article recently that we called Frictionless Philanthropy, which I think is actually a journey that Emerson is on. Our realization right after the election was we had hundreds of organizations in our portfolio that we knew really well. We trusted them, we honored their work. And so right after the election, we called folks and said, what do you need to get through this time? And that was the beginning of this realization that we already had all these open pipes, and the best thing we could do was put dollars through the pipes we had. So part of our work has really been around asking, what are the different permutations of that opportunity? So soon after we explicitly called people and said, what do you need? We ran a grant round that we called the Justice and Unity Grant Round, which was an opportunity for anyone in the portfolio, regardless of size, regardless of the work you did, as long as it was in the domestic US, to tell us what you wanted to do to make your community more just, give more opportunity to more people. And 80% of our grantees applied for that grant round. It was incredibly stunning, actually, and the stories that people shared. And so we ended up doing a grant round far larger than we thought we would do because the stories were so powerful. So on one side, I guess we've been on a journey of asking, how do you allow philanthropy to happen more freely? We recognize we're an institution in some ways. We recognize we're run by an individual, and so we have a level of flexibility, but we really have tried to demonstrate how that happens. We also run a fairly large capacity building program. We have pieces of it that we call small d democratic philanthropy, which means anyone who's in the portfolio can take advantage of a set of management and leadership opportunities anytime they want. They send in receipts and we reimburse them. But we've actually, over the last year and a half, as part of our learning tour and listening tour, increased the footprint of those opportunities quite a lot. We're running a pilot now around mental health grants, and what we've heard from people about how they've used the dollars they've been given has been very, very humbling, and I think will actually roll up to be a much more big and comprehensive program. And we've also just continued to do a lot more coaching, management support, governance support, but that's another piece, is how do you demonstratively indicate that capacity building, giving people resilience as leaders, as teams, is incredibly important. And I wanted to just share one very specific learning we took out of our listening and learning tour, which has become programmatically pretty interesting. We do a lot of work in immigration. Our 3 pillar areas are education, immigration, and the environment. And in this particular time, access to legal services is actually really the key to whether people successfully get through the process they're in the middle of or not, for most. And our realization was that legal services were greatly disparately matched to where people actually needed support. And so we have a matrix, you know, I could do this, but it wouldn't be very helpful to you, but there's a geographic piece, urban, rural, near a border, and then there's various situations of people. They are or aren't documented. They are or aren't with their children. They are or aren't in a place where they're actually sort of surrounded by people that they know and who can take care of them versus if they're in a detention facility, for example. And we've actually started to work our way through that matrix. And this was because we were out on a listening learning tour and we heard where there was opportunity and where there was deficit to fill in those places on the matrix with the acknowledgement sometimes the lawyers are there, sometimes they go as volunteers, sometimes they're volunteers who are trained who aren't lawyers to do certain kinds of work, but it's been an interesting patchwork to build. And so I guess we've been on the journey of asking if you actually have free dollars and you really are deeply mission aligned, how do you get them to places where there's need with the acknowledgement that on some level there's a level of diligence you need to do to know where quality service is happening, or where good thinking is occurring. And then after that, you actually have to be much more flexible about how you let dollars get to places so it can thrive.
And so, Jamie, will you close us up? You're already a purpose-driven business. What's next?
Yeah, so what we've done is we have realized that, just like Bill was talking about, underserved markets have unmet needs, but there are structural barriers that are preventing a well-functioning market from serving it very well. So what we've done is we've brought together our foundation, our community support resources, and business leaders. I run a business in Prudential. And we've realized that if we use the full power of our capabilities across all those resources, we can identify what the structural barriers are and begin knocking them down, whether or not it's policy or access, or is it products, or is it education, or is it literacy, and is it that our current offering set doesn't work because we don't yet have the insights about that particular community. We brought all those folks together, and we've realized that we can come up with new solutions for that underserved market that actually better everybody. One of the best examples that we've worked on with Prosperity Now is how to address emergency savings at the workplace. People were saving for retirement effectively, but couldn't access that money that they've saved to pay for the $500 car bill in an emergency. Together, we've put together a sidecar solution that allows individuals to save at the workplace in an emergency savings pot in a very liquid, safe, institutionally priced product that allows them to get the match from their employer for their retirement plan. And they can get access to this product whenever they need to. When they use up some of that money, their savings dollars go back and fill up the emergency savings bucket, and then they'll overflow into the retirement bucket. If we can do things like that around student loans, around housing, around other protection solutions, people can manage their income volatility today so that they can be prepared for unexpected risks in the future and be prepared for the long term as well. It's about partnering with all of you, with my peers up here on this panel, so that we all come together and come up with solutions using all of our resources to knock down those systemic structural barriers.
So join me in thanking this extraordinary panel for their inspiring work, their generosity of spirit, and their ability to see how we bring change in the future. And with that, I want to welcome my colleague, Melissa Grober-Morrow, and Song Rise, who are going to continue this inspiration with a little bit of a melody and take us to our next step. So thank you.